In March 1776, as cannon fire echoed around Boston and the Continental Congress debated independence, a woman on a Massachusetts farm picked up her pen and issued one of the boldest political challenges of the Revolutionary era, writing to her husband, who would soon help draft a new nation's legal foundation. Abigail Adams urged him to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. She warned that women would, quote, not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And this was no casual aside. It was a strategic intervention in the formation of American law. And at that moment, Abigail had no vote, no office, no formal authority, yet she was shaping the political imagination of one of the principal architects of the Republic, John Adams. So that paradox, power without position, is what makes her leadership truly remarkable. In Abigail Adams, the book, historian Woody Hulton reveals Abigail not as a passive presidential spouse, but as an economic strategist, political confidant, a wartime manager, and a moral advocate. When interpreted through the leadership frameworks articulated by Peter G. Nordhaus, Abigail becomes a compelling case study in leadership exercised from the margin of formal power. I'm Blaine Hone, and I'm thrilled to have been reading about Abigail as a study in leadership. And this analysis provides 5 leadership theories articulated by Nordhaus to evaluate both Abigail Adams and the influence that she had and the effectiveness she had as a leader, as well as those things that might be considered a weakness or limitation for Abigail's leadership. So let's dive right in. The first is transformational leadership. And this is all about vision beyond the moment. Transformational leadership inspires followers through moral vision, intellectual stimulation, and elevated purpose. The end goal of such leadership has a new transformed individual as the outcome on the other end of it. So let's talk about who it was that Abigail was transforming and how they were different. Certainly, it all happened through her husband, so maybe it was, in fact, first her husband that she was seeking transformation in. But the reality is, there's a whole bunch of effects that came from her influence that we need to take note of. So Abigail's remember the ladies appeal was not rhetorical flourish. It was an early articulation of gender equity within a framework of the revolution. And she perceived a contradiction. A nation founded on liberty could not coherently deny legal recognition of half its population. And that insight reflects transformational vision, seeing beyond the immediate political moment. Furthermore, she had a really broad influence of activity. So during the Revolutionary War, Abigail managed the Adams farm, which British troops occupied nearby Boston. So she was in really close proximity to the war itself. She personally inoculated her children against smallpox in 1776, a controversial and risky decision at the time. And that demonstrated moral courage and pragmatic leadership. Her resilience made her a model of civic virtue within her community. So again, in these cases, who was different because of her way of being? Certainly, she wasn't just some lady on a farm doing things a little differently. So let's talk about her inspirational motivation and come back to all of those questions. Her letters consistently reinforced the moral necessity of independence. In 1777, she wrote, "These are the times in which a genius would wish to live," and goes on to talk about why the revolution itself creates such opportunity that is a privilege, as she saw it, to involve herself in. So rather than the despair at the hardship, she reframed sacrifice as historical privilege. Furthermore, she offered a lot of intellectual stimulation. And this is where a lot of the transformation, I think, came in. John Adams frequently sought her counsel. He once referred to her as his dearest friend and most trusted correspondent. So Abigail critiqued proposed laws, though. She didn't always agree with whatever it was that John was doing. In fact, often criticized some of the things that she knew he had written or was pursuing. She warned against unchecked power and challenged assumptions about women's legal status, and she did not echo anything. She interrogated. So one more consideration is the individualized idea of how it was that she went about transforming individuals, herself, her community, and eventually, I think, the fabric of a nation that had effects globally. So, and here's the part about the individuals that she was working with. Abigail educated her own children very rigorously, despite lacking formal schooling herself. She supervised their reading in history, philosophy, politics. Her son, future President John Quincy Adams, credited her influence as foundational to his intellectual formation. So Abigail did not draft the Constitution, but she influenced the man who helped shape it, John Adams. And then John Quincy Adams, who helped implement the ideals articulated in the Constitution. And that's transformational leadership exercised relationally rather than institutionally. So her relationships with specific individuals and her working with them to ultimately have them adopt new ideals and become new individuals or transformed in the way that they do things because of her inspiration is transformational leadership in its finest. So let's move on to the second lens of leadership, and that would be authentic leadership or integrity under constraint. Authentic leadership centers on transparency, internal moral grounding, and consistency between beliefs and behavior. And Holden's biography emphasizes Abigail's candor. And that, I think, represents a lot of that transparency we're talking about. She did not tailor her opinions for political comfort. On slavery, Abigail condemned slavery as incompatible with revolutionary ideals. In 1774, she wrote that it was a most iniquitous scheme to fight for liberty while holding others in bondage. And this stance was not politically convenient in elite circles. Now, on women's legal status, her frustration was explicit. Quote, "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands," end quote. She recognized the legal doctrine of coverture as structurally oppressive. And it was. On vulnerability, Abigail's letters reveal loneliness, grief, anxiety during John's prolonged absences in Europe. She did not present a facade of stoic perfection. Her transparency strengthened relational trust. So authenticity made her influence durable. Her moral consistency created credibility. And all of these were the essential leadership currency of adaptive leadership. So let's look at the next form of leadership, or the next framework, and that's adaptive leadership. Leading amid revolutionary disruption gave the perfect laboratory for Abigail to exercise adaptive leadership, which mobilizes people to navigate uncertainty and systemic upheaval. That's the idea of adaptive leadership. And so the application of this during the war was it provided all kinds of experience for her. First, in economic management, she oversaw crop production, tenant relations, livestock management, and investment decisions. Another factor that influenced her adaptivity was inflation in Massachusetts. It skyrocketed during the war, and Abigail engaged in shrewd trading strategies that at times outperformed male contemporaries in preserving capital. The health crisis that I mentioned earlier, where she inoculated her children in 1776, they were inoculated against smallpox because of the outbreak that had been going throughout the colonies. And there was a lot of social backlash for her doing so. And the procedure required weeks of quarantine, and it carried a real mortality risk to her children. In regards to property protection, with British troops nearby, she monitored military movements and relayed intelligence to John. So she once observed the actual Battle of Bunker Hill from a hill near their home. While managing all these crises, she sustained intellectual correspondence with John and nurtured civic literacy in her children. So Northouse describes adaptive leaders as those who regulate distress and maintain disciplined attention. And Abigail embodied this not in speeches, but in survival strategies. So let's move on to the next lens that we'll evaluate Abigail's leadership under, and that's by path goal theory. You look at the effectiveness of leaders removing obstacles and clarifying pathways to get the goals that they seek. Now, Abigail's goals were lofty, and they included certain moral objectives that would have impacts that were far-reaching. And Abigail articulated bold goals: legal equity, moral coherence, expanded liberty, but she lacked institutional mechanisms to operationalize them. So her influence operated largely through private correspondence with elite men. It turns out her husband and her son. John Adams famously responded to her plea with humor, calling men's dominance a despotism of the petticoat, as a joke. Abigail could define the destination, but she couldn't always restructure the road. But then again, it was a pretty revolutionary restructuring that she might have tried to implement. So the success she did have shouldn't be outweighed by the fact that the limitations she had were not intellectual, they were structural. Her leadership demonstrated how social systems constrain even truly visionary leaders. So a second lens of looking at maybe some of the limitations that Abigail had is the trait theory, looking at strengths and blind spots. Intellectual rigor was one of her strengths. And despite limited formal schooling, Abigail read widely in political philosophy and history. Also, she was very conscientious. Her meticulous record keeping and disciplined correspondence, over 1,100 letters survived between her and John alone. So that reflects extraordinary cognitive stamina, right? Moral courage: she publicly criticized entrenched injustices. And she had emotional resilience in space. She endured the death of children, wartime instability, and long separations from her husband. So what do all these really great strengths lend themselves to? Well, Holton, in the biography, notes that Abigail could be politically sharp and socially exclusive. In other words, she alienated some people and created distrust because of her own distrust in certain democratic movements. She could be dismissive of populist critics. Her Federalist loyalties narrowed her tolerance for political opponents. And so her strength of conviction sometimes bordered on rigidity in a way that I think limited her access to others that she would have otherwise influenced. And so trait theory reminds us that strengths, when intensified or radicalized, can become constraints. So those 5 theories in whole lead me to wanting to form my own Abigail Adams framework for leadership. And here it is. The first tenet, I guess, of this framework would be influence without title, right? Abigail never held elected office, but she influenced presidential thought. While serving as president, John Adams frequently solicited Abigail's political judgment through letters, once calling her his most faithful and able advisor. So another accolade that he was publicly willing to share and say to the world that this is the influence that I'm receiving. She held no office, yet her counsel shaped cabinet appointments, diplomatic perspectives, and party strategy. And yeah, she got a lot of backlash for that, but the influence that it affected was executed and implemented nonetheless. So she demonstrated that authority can flow from intellect and trust rather than position. So the second tenet is moral imagination. She recognized contradictions in revolutionary rhetoric before most of her peers. And in her March 31st, 1776 letter urging John to remember the ladies, Abigail Adams exposed the contradiction between revolutionary liberty and women's legal subordination. And at that moment, when independence rhetoric centered on freedom from tyranny, she extended the logic of equality beyond its accepted boundaries. Decades before organized women's rights movement, her imagination of a world better than the one that just simply existed was truly admirable. So the third tenet is strategic resilience. Leadership credibility is forged in hardship management. During the Revolutionary War, Abigail managed all of the farm, the finances, the business affairs, all of the things that we talked about. Yet she persevered and even expanded the Adams estate, proving that credibility in leadership is often earned through competent crisis stewardship. So fourth, relational intelligence. Private trust can shape public history. Or correspondence, again, like we talked about, influenced those who influenced a nation that would influence the world. Finally, structural awareness. Vision must be paired with institutional mechanisms for durable change. So even recognizing the limitations that Abigail herself had, she understood that the ideals required systems and infrastructure, and she was depending on the people she was influencing to try and create those. And she herself implemented as much change as she possibly could and was quite successful in much of it. And I think set up the world for a lot of opportunity to continue to thrive on the leadership that she did implement. So in conclusion, Abigail Adams demonstrated that leadership can flourish in constraint. She was transformational in vision, authentic in voice, adaptive in crisis, yet structurally limited by her era's legal and political architecture. Her life presses modern leaders to ask, where am I exercising influence without title? What moral inconsistency requires articulation? How can adaptive competence become systemic reform? What structural barriers must be addressed to translate vision into reality? And leadership's often memorialized in marble, but sometimes it's forged in ink, line by line, letter by letter, with a pen. Thank you.